So, welcome back to another episode. And tonight we're going to be continuing our discussion of Legitimation Crisis by Jürgen Habermas. And the focus tonight is going to be on what he has to say about language and a little bit about his theory of universal pragmatics to try to help complete the picture of how it is that his discussion of language and communication is significant for his ideas about how culture evolves, how society evolves. As has been the case for the past few discussions, I'm going to begin with the same central organizing principle that we've had in the past, which was the life-world system dichotomy that Habermas begins his book Legitimation Crisis with. To start, I thought I would invoke an Aristotelian principle. It's a principle of gaining knowledge, which is that you start from things that you already know before proceeding to things that you do not know. And that can also be used as a teaching principle, as a tool to help facilitate understanding. What I have in mind is simply that one way to bring that duality of system and life world into a little bit better focus, maybe bring it a little bit more vividly to life, is to try comparing that duality or that contrast with a contrast between the idea of organization as parallel to the idea of system and life world as somewhat analogous to the term life world is somewhat analogous to the term culture. So the system life world duality or contrast could be compared with what's probably a more readily visible, understandable duality, the duality of organization versus culture. And many of the same conclusions can be drawn by thinking about that contrast. What do organizations have that makes them successful or not successful in relation to the culture that they are trying to administer, represent, fulfill the desires, goals, ambitions, and purposes of? How do they do that? And how do they either succeed or fail in a society? If you think about the system life world contrast in those terms, organizations on the one hand and society on the other, to what extent are those organizations legitimized? To what extent can they be considered legitimate? And what are the conditions under which a culture or a society might begin to doubt their legitimacy? All those ways that you could apply those same issues to the society that we now live in are issues that are applicable directly to Habermas's discussion of systems and life world. And the distinction between the two sets of contrasting terms is simply that the terms system and life world are just more all-encompassing. Life world encompasses more than just culture, the basic idea of culture. Life world encompasses linguistic factors. It encompasses all sorts of characteristics that could be brought in that comprise the bigger sculpture, the bigger picture of how a life within a world could be represented for a particular individual, from a particular individual's perspective. And system is just a more encompassing term for the entire set of systems and structures that are built up upon the basic bedrock of the activities of people in society. So I think by bringing a little bit more clarity and perhaps liveliness to those terms, we can have a little bit more of a jumping off point for understanding what's at stake in Habermas's discussion and legitimation crisis. This can serve as a jumping off point into talking about language, because Habermas associates language, the issues that come up concerning language and communication, directly with the capacity for a society to evolve. Or you could think of a society as a culture to evolve, for an individual's experience within a society to evolve and improve from a life world perspective. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. And the first thing I would like to do is to just read a little bit from Legitimation Crisis as a starting point. So this starts on page 9 at the very bottom. Social systems adapt inner nature to society with the help of normative structures in which needs are interpreted and actions licensed and or made obligatory. The concept of motivation that appears here should not conceal the specific fact that social systems accomplish the integration of inner nature through the medium of norms that have need of justification. These imply again a validity claim that can only be redeemed discursively. To the truth claims that we raise in empirical statements, there correspond claims of correctness or appropriateness that we advance with norms of action or of evaluation. Social systems can maintain themselves vis-a-vis outer nature through instrumental actions according to technical rules, and vis-a-vis inner nature through communicative actions according to valid norms. Because at the sociocultural stage of development, animal behavior is reorganized under imperatives of validity claims. This reorganization is effected in structures of linguistically produced intersubjectivity. And then skipping down, generality means objectivity of knowledge and legitimacy of valid norms. Both ensure the community or shared meaning that is constitutive for the socio-cultural life world. The structures of intersubjectivity are just as constitutive for experiences and instrumental action as they are for attitudes and communicative action. These same structures regulate, at the systems level, the control of outer and the integration of inner nature. That is, the processes of adapting to society that, by virtue of the competencies of socially related individuals, operate through the peculiar media of utterances that admit of truth and norms that require justification. So, just a few reflections on what I've just read before we move on to a discussion of communication itself. One thing you'll notice there is he brings up inner nature and outer nature, and inner nature is something like our inner world, our whole world of thoughts and feelings and motivations, and outer nature could be just simply the world around us. And his concern with that could be compared with something that Piaget was doing at about the same time. Piaget tried to use biology as a basis for discussing human development, and one of his basic ideas was that our higher order development, you might say, is basically the same, tries to accomplish the same basic feat that our lower order nature tries to accomplish, or lower life form organisms try to accomplish, which is trying to create an equilibrium between their inner world and their outer world. And when you think of higher order aptitudes of a human being, what is understanding? What is knowledge? Why are we driven to try to understand and know and to sort out the true from the false? We're driven by the same sorts of need to try to adequate our inner nature with outer nature, to try to adapt and grow and develop in such a way that we can maintain a certain level of comfort, stability, you could say stasis, that allows for an optimum growth for the organism. All of our attempts to try to adapt to the world around ourselves as we're growing and developing ourselves could be explained by that basic sort of paradigm. And Habermas seems to be alluding to a similar sort of idea. How are we as individuals in a society adequating ourselves to the challenges of that society, to things in our outer environment that are causing us to try to rise to the challenge of the need to adapt ourselves to the world around ourselves? And one of the ways that people in a society as a whole try to do that is through communicative action. If there's a problem that arises, if there's a crisis of some sort, and we've seen quite a few crises and things that have got people talking recently about politics, those represents the sort of things that can push people in society to try to adapt, grow, change, understand the reality around them, and possibly to find solutions, to think differently, to form different thoughts and ideas so that they can adapt themselves to what they see going on in the world around them. And communicative action is certainly an important part of that. So I'll read this sentence one more time. Social systems can maintain themselves vis-a-vis outer nature through instrumental actions and vis-a-vis inner nature through communicative actions, because at the socio-cultural stage of development, animal behavior is reorganized under imperatives of validity claims. This reorganization is effected in structures of linguistically produced intersubjectivity. So a question that this raises is exactly what does Habermas mean by the term communicative action? And what he has in mind is turning away from looking at language and the problems associated with language, turning away from the simple analysis of statements into their logical parts, which would be familiar to people who have gone through courses in linguistic philosophy, people who are familiar with breaking down everyday sentences into their logical structure and that sort of thing, and turning away from that kind of model to the idea of a speech act rather than a sentence, a speech act that takes place as a communicative action somewhere in an actual living context within society somewhere. And the speech act is going to be the basic unit of analysis, something that needs to be explained before the other parts of the puzzle can be put together. To begin discussing speech acts, we actually need to dig into Habermas's theory of universal pragmatics and start discussing what that means. And here's my take. Universal pragmatics is a theory that applies to language in use and to the universal conditions for successful communication. And notice the word use there immediately should take you back to Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein did something very similar, where he argued that the basic foundation for understanding meaning, for discussing meaning, should be the use that language is put to, rather than trying to formulate some kind of theory of meaning just by looking at sentences and trying to connect individual words to their reference in the world. And there are a few basic structural points that need to be made about universal pragmatics to fill in the picture of what Habermas thinks those universally valid conditions for communication must be. And there's an acronym that I put together that if you want to use to just recall what those conditions are, I've created. And it's UTSA, or under the same act, is the phrase that I use to remember it. So under the same act recalls that these conditions refer to a speech act and to the goal of communicating successfully. So UTSA stands for the claim should be understandable, T should be true, S sincere, and A stands for appropriate. Okay, I've thought of a scenario that can try to bring this to life a little bit and why this is important. These universal validity claims are mainly set up as a way to try to overcome skepticism about meaning in communication, because you can imagine some kind of skeptic, perhaps a Derridian skeptic, who wants to try to claim that meaning is something that is ineffable and something that we can never arrive at any certainty of. And Habermas seems to want to say that under certain conditions we could actually do that, which is kind of interesting given, what it might take to overcome a skeptical claim like that. So the scenario is this. So imagine that we have someone, in my mind, I'm imagining a stick figure on a chalkboard. Let's say that this stick figure, has a particular desire. Okay, and this kind of goes back to my way of reading Aristotle as far as what motivates actions and that sort of thing. So if we have an action, we should have a motivation. If we want a deliberate action, then we should have a desire that motivates it, and then a process of deliberating about how best to achieve the action. So there's intent there as well that needs to be expressed as part of this picture of what goes into this act of communication. There's a desire to be understood. There's the intent to be understood. And then there is the deliberation about the best way to communicate in order to achieve that. So all those components go into the act of uttering something. And let's say that the person says, the car won't start. So under these conditions, the person is sincere, trying to be understood, saying something truthful, and appropriate to the circumstances. You can imagine a situation in which the person didn't deliberate very well about the best way to communicate, and perhaps when they said the car won't start, they failed to specify which car wouldn't start. Imagine that in this scenario, there's a teenager, somebody's 17 years old, maybe he's telling his parents the car won't start. Well, which car is it? You might assume that it's his car, but given the context, he could be just relaying information, maybe from mom or from dad to somebody else, and saying the car won't start. Well, is that his car? Is that dad's car? Is that mom's car? We really have no way of knowing unless something further is specified. So perhaps a better way to communicate to overcome that ambiguity would be the Chrysler won't start, the Pontiac won't start, something like that, in order to communicate more clearly. And if those conditions are met, which go hand in hand with the whole desire to communicate effectively, sincerely, so as to be understood, truthfully, etc., in an appropriate fashion, let's say not ironically or something like that, successful communication can take place. And that these are the conditions that must be met in order to overcome skepticism that would just lead us into an endless discussion of what was actually meant by saying the car won't start. You can imagine a situation where the car won't start becomes some sort of slang. Like you can imagine a family where a father says the car won't start on some particular occasion. It gets interpreted just as an excuse for not wanting to go somewhere, not wanting to run a particular errand or something like that. And so maybe within the family, car won't start becomes kind of a joke, or it becomes kind of a slang way of saying, I don't want to do something. You can imagine some sort of scenario where what is said is not actually what is meant. And meeting those criteria, the UTSA criteria, allows us to overcome those sorts of situations. There is something I would like to bring up that is discussed by John Searle in his book Speech Acts, an essay in the philosophy of language that relates directly to this kind of problem. What I want to bring up is something he calls the principle of expressibility, which is the idea that if somebody says something, there must be a way to express what the person meant. If the person really meant something when they said it, there must be a way to express that meaning. Okay, now this is an assumption that has to be built into the attempt to communicate and make communication possible. And I'd like to just read this quote to you, just so you can get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. It might seem that my approach is simply, in Saussurean terms, a study of parole rather than langue. So parole there would be the study of individual acts of communication rather than the study of language. So Searle and Habermas are on the same page as far as that goes, where their focus is. Their focus is on interpersonal communication. And then he goes on, I am arguing, however, that an adequate study of speech acts is a study of langue. And that would be, at least in part, as a way to ground the idea of communication. And then he goes on, there is an important reason why this is true, which goes beyond the claim that communication necessarily involves speech acts. I take it to be an analytic truth about language that whatever can be meant can be said. Okay, let me just read that one more time. I take it to be an analytic truth about language that whatever can be meant can be said. So what that would imply is that for anything that anyone says, there is some interpretation that can be given that would count as an adequate interpretation of what the person meant when they said something. In other words, there is a way to arrive at an adequate interpretation for any given expression in a language. A given language may not have a syntax or a vocabulary rich enough for me to say what I mean in that language, but there are no barriers in principle to supplementing the impoverished language or saying what I mean in a richer one. Okay, and then we skip down. The last quote was from page 17, but now I'm on page 18. Quote, therefore, it is in principle possible for every speech act one performs or could perform to be uniquely determined by a given sentence or set of sentences, given the assumptions that the speaker is speaking literally and that the context is appropriate. So there we have a couple of conditions that Searle brings in, And I would just say that Habermas really is trying to do the same sort of thing and say that anything that's expressed in the context of a speech act can potentially be interpreted correctly by some other sentence. So in my example earlier, the father says, the car won't start. But what he really means is, I don't want to go out. That is the correct interpretation of that expression. Or perhaps when the teenager says the car won't start, what he really means is that the Chrysler won't start, or the Pontiac won't start, or however the sentence may be clarified in order to give it its true meaning. And what Searle and Habermas are going to try to claim, which might seem like their riskiest claim, is that in order for communication really to be successful and to overcome the kind of skepticism I mentioned earlier, we need to have not only those universal conditions built in, the UTSA, but we also need this further condition that Searle calls the principle of expressibility. And I think it's worth emphasizing here that what he has in mind is a sentence, something that can be uttered, that will clarify or explain the sentence that is either ambiguous or requires some sort of communicative action to facilitate further understanding. So that is a good jumping off point, I think, for jumping into Habermas's discussion of universal pragmatics in a book entitled Communication and the Evolution of Society. Toward the very beginning of his essay, What is Universal Pragmatics?, he presents us with a diagram where he shows us two levels of interpretation that are involved in different kinds of speech acts, or communicative actions. And they correspond to three different levels of understanding. Okay, so level one refers to our direct perception of observable events. Level two invokes sentences that relate directly to those observations, and he calls those observation sentences. So this would be the first level at which interpretation is needed. How do you interpret those sentences that count as observation sentences? So the car won't start, the paper is white, the chair is hard, whatever it is that relates to that first level. And then we have a third level, which involves interpretive sentences. So these are sentences that involve some kind of symbolic reconstruction of states of affairs in the world, or symbolic reconstruction in more general terms. But they sit above and in relation to those sentences that are sentences about the world. Those involve two different levels of interpretation. An observation that I would like to make about this relates to the debate between Russell and Frege over sense and reference, that I think is important to bring up in the context of further understanding Searle's expressibility principle. So for Frege, the way that we get to understanding what is being referred to is through a sense. So normally we could just say the moon, and somebody might know what we were referring to. But suppose we were in a situation where maybe late at night, maybe there's some stuff going on in a fraternity, and we're not really sure what's meant by moon in this context. Okay, so if anybody wanted clarification as to what sort of moon was being referred to, we could invoke the sense of moon, and that would help us to fix the reference. So if the moon that the speaker had in mind was the moon that's up in the sky, the bright object, etc., whatever sort of description you want to bring in, that would be a way of fixing the reference, giving the sense of what was meant in order to help the listener interpret exactly what they were pointing to. Now, what Russell did, which is very interesting, is that he tried to eliminate that mediating ground between sense and reference. And he tried to say that the meaning of terms is not their sense. That's not what's meant, but what is meant is the thing referred to itself. So for Russell, if you read through some of Russell's books, Problems of Philosophy, Philosophy of Logical Atomism, his paper on denoting, that basic orientation can help explain why he does a lot of things that he does. And it also explains the kinds of problems that are continually evoked by Russell and what drives him toward more and more logical analysis of sentences. So, for example, if somebody presents you with a sentence, just to illustrate how this is significant, somebody presents you with a sentence, the marigold is yellow, or the marigold is orange. The marigold pretty clearly refers to something. So supposing that there is a unique flower that I'm referring to, the marigold, we could just go ahead and say that the reference, that particular marigold, is what was meant. And there we don't have to trying to decide about the existence of this meaning that is supposed to help us to get to that reference. Because the debate about whether to keep Fregean senses around has to do with what sort of ontological status we should give them, whether they exist and how, and they exist in a separate realm, which is something that Frege was actually willing to say. He wanted to say that these senses could be appealed to in the same way that mathematical objects are appealed to as something purely ideal. Russell wanted to eliminate this set of ideal objects. And so far, so good. We have a marigold. That is the meaning of the expression, the marigold itself. But what do we do about the yellow? Because the way that yellow is interpreted is yellow is a universal, and you can't refer to a universal. So what Russell does later on in Philosophy of Logical Atomism is he comes up with this theory about a yellow patch and tries to say that when we use words like yellow or orange or invoke words that sound like we're referring to a general statement instead of a particular thing that come up constantly in language, those can in some cases be reduced to our immediate experience of a culture, of a particular patch of color in our visual field. So he does things like that to try to make his theory of meaning work. And it kind of hobbles along. And he also uses some tricks of logical analysis. And without going too much into those, the main upshot of his strategy, you could say, would be to try to restrict existence claims to things that can be asserted as bound variables, which is an expression that anticipates what Quine later tries to do. And I think they're basically trying to do the same thing. So when somebody says, the King of France is bald, which is a famous statement out of his article on denoting, there's nothing for that statement to refer to. And it would seem like Russell should have a problem here because there's nothing to refer to, and yet the statement is meaningful. And he has this theory of meaning, which says that the reference of a thing is what it means. But there's no King of France for that statement to refer to, and it does seem like that statement is meaningful. The King of France is bald. it would seem absurd to say that the sentence is meaningless, because it clearly isn't. So how does Russell deal with a problem like this? Well, he goes back to his logical symbolism, and without trying to explicate that, the way the logical symbolism works is that it makes two claims. It makes an existence claim. There is some X that has those attributes, and that it has those attributes uniquely. So what you can say is that the only existence claim that is being made here is that there is some X that has those properties of being the King of France, and that unique individual has the property of being bald. Because the statement is false, it is nevertheless a meaningful claim, because it is about, and here, I feel like I'm going to run into trouble. I forget the exact way in which Russell tries to make it come out as meaningful, but it is false, but the only claim as to the existence of the thing is that it refers to the particular X. So we know what the terms King of France means. We know what the terms bald means. And I suppose Russell can find a way to make those terms meaningful on their own, but in the context of this sentence, they don't refer to anything. And maybe I'll have to come back to that to give maybe a more convincing explanation. But no claim needs to be made there as regards the ontological status of a thing that exists and yet is meaningful, because the thing doesn't exist. So that's a way out for Russell. I'm just going to read a tiny bit out of Quine's On What There Is, because it's kind of a famous statement about this. So this is from page 12, from a logical point of view, in the first essay on what there is. I have already suggested a negative answer to this question in speaking of bound variables, or variables of quantification, in connection with Russell's theory of descriptions. We can very easily involve ourselves in ontological commitments by saying, for example, that there is something, a bound variable. So there we have the beginning of the logical way of expressing the sentence. There is some X. The variable that X that's included in that statement is the bound variable, which houses and sunsets have in common, or that there is something which is a prime number larger than 1,000,000. But this is essentially the only way we can involve ourselves in ontological commitments, by our use of bound variables. So what Quine wants to bring in to try to solve some of the problems of this debate, and Quine is somebody that feels with Russell like we shouldn't expand our universe of entities to include meanings. What kind of entities are meanings? Why imagine some sort of heaven of meanings where numbers exist and meanings exist? And what he's going to say is that we can get rid of a lot of those by simply restricting our existence claims to things that are determined by a bound variable. So the only existence claim that's being made in the present King of France is bald has to do with the individual who has those attributes. And that claim happens to be false. So therefore, no existence claim is being made. This is a way for Quine and Russell to do away with this realm of entities that they do not like. Okay, I think Quine calls it being parsimonious in some essay or other. But steering our way back to the issues at hand, we were talking about universal pragmatics and what relates to the problem of meaning in universal pragmatics on page 10 comes out from Habermas like this. I can explicate the meaning of such an utterance. Naturally, only when the meaning of the symbolic formulation is unclear does the explication need to be set off as an independent analytic step. In regard to sentences with which we describe events, there can be questions at different levels. If the phenomenon described needs explanation, we demand a causal description that makes clear how the phenomenon in question comes to pass. If, by contrast, the description itself is incomprehensible, we demand an explication that makes clear what the observer meant by his utterance and how the symbolic expression in need of elucidation comes about. So that refers to his idea of rational reconstruction. If you want to understand an utterance, you have to reconstruct the conditions under which it was uttered as a preliminary to understanding what was meant. In the first case, a satisfactory answer will have the form of an explanation we undertake with the aid of a causal hypothesis. In the second case, we speak of explication of meaning. Of course, explications of meaning need not be limited to descriptive sentences. Any meaningfully structured formation can be subjected to the operation of meaning explication. What we have there is Habermas siding with Searle on this principle of expressibility, which, as I said, was the idea that for any expression, there's got to be some other expression that can be brought in to explicate the meaning of what was said or uttered or communicated in some way. And this puts Habermas and Frege, Habermas and Searle, both in the Fregean camp. So they're both going to appeal to some meaning, and I don't think either one of them tries to get into the ontological issues that it involves. But there's going to be some sentence that can be uttered that clarifies exactly what was meant. So this is one of the basic assumptions behind both Habermas and Searle. And I believe that gives an adequate enough account of what Habermas is trying to do in his universal pragmatics. Ultimately, it's an attempt to overcome skepticism about the possibility of communicating by showing exactly what conditions can be invoked in order to ensure that communication can take place. So that also brings into the picture exactly what's meant by communicative action. Communicative action involves speech acts, but if we want to understand exactly the context in which the maximum chance of the communication being understood so that society can evolve and grow, it would be in circumstances like someone saying the car won't start, where someone has a genuine intent to be understood, is sincere about what they're saying, is saying something they regard as true, etc. Something that's uttered in a way that's appropriate to the circumstances. So let me just see if there's anything else I wanted to bring up here. This principle of expressibility really brings us right back to some Fregean notions of exactly where we get meaning and how meaning can be understood. For both Habermas and Searle is more of an originator than Habermas in this particular circumstance. The idea is that if somebody meant something at all when they were saying something, that meaning can be explicated in some way. There is some sentence that can be uttered that will clarify it. And the further assumption that goes back to Frege himself is the idea that meaning is something public rather than private. So private meanings would be meanings that are just inside our own heads. And I think that's probably the way most people think about meaning. They think about, when they communicate something, the meaning that they had is something inside their head. It may or may not be something that they could express. But Frege was part of a movement that originally goes back to a group called the Austrian realists, who were very much against psychologism. And what Frege tried to do was to avoid invoking any sort of psychology in explaining meaning. And for a lot of people, this is a definite advantage to his theory. We don't have to do much more to understand language if we follow Frege than look at language itself. There's no reason, if we follow Frege in trying to understand language and communication, to try to peer into someone's mind and try to understand what they were doing, how they were motivated, or any of those other factors. We simply look at what they said, and if we need clarification, what they meant can potentially be clarified by some statement of some kind. When the teenager said, "The car won't start," what he meant was, "The Pontiac won't start." That clarifies what was meant. That helps to fix the reference that we require for clarification. So with that, I think we've said enough about language. We've covered quite a bit of ground. Although the point about the controversy between Russell and Frege is not as pertinent to Habermas as some of the other points, I think it is a very useful contrast to have on the way to trying to understand what Frege is all about. One further point I want to make, now that I've just recalled it, is that when I've been talking about these points where we ask for clarification, and this relates back to a couple of lectures ago, I was talking about points where people need to refer to the rules when they're playing a game of chess. And you could say that these points when communication breaks down, when both Habermas discusses them or when Searle discusses them, could be thought of as points in communication where people have to refer to the rules of the game. So ordinarily, we can just play the game and not have to worry about the rules. And that could be thought of as the everyday flow of communication where communication problems don't arise. But what happens when people become skeptical about meaning or raise difficulties about meaning? Well, suddenly we begin to have to refer back to the rules. And for Habermas, those rules that can be appealed to overcome skepticism about someone meaning anything at all would be those basic UTSA principles, communicative principles, the intent to be understood, sincerity in communication, truthfulness, and appropriateness of the expression that get us back into the flow of communication once more. In the context of legitimation crisis, there could be a point at which people begin to question certain things in society, points where communication begins to break down and people begin to discuss something. Could be racism, could be white privilege, whatever those things are where communication seems to break down and people are asking about meanings and trying to decide what's actually being referred to, are those moments when the rules need to be appealed to. What actually was meant? Is anything being meant here at all? And there enters in the principle of expressibility. To say something meaningfully is to have a potentially expressible meaning. So I'm just laying these principles out for evaluation. I am not staking any claim about whether they're good or adequate or sound principles, but they are foundational ideas that need to be uncovered. What Habermas wants to say is that those points when we're appealing to the rules, where communication breaks down, are discursive moments when we can begin to have an opportunity to evolve through communication toward a better society. So with that, I will leave the discussion for tonight. What I intend to do next time is to discuss the systems side rather than the language side. So with that, say good night for the evening.